India has a very different view of Quad than, say, what the expectations of the US would be or Australia would be.
You're listening to the USSC Briefing Room, a podcast from the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney, where we give you a seat at the table for a USSC briefing on the latest developments in US news and foreign policy. We'll cover what you need to know and what's beneath the surface of the news.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the USSC Briefing Room. My name is Jared Monshine. I'm the Director of Studies at the US Study Center. And before we get started today, I want to first acknowledge the Gadigal people of the our nation and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So, India has been a topic in Australia that seems to, with every year, become more dominant of the headlines, whether it be the Australia-India relationship or the Quad, or just the trajectory of India's growth and geopolitical power. But with that all said, we just had some pretty momentous shifts in the makeup of India's political system. We had elections that seemed to have potentially changed the trajectory of the well-known Modi. Now, to discuss this all with me, I have the perfect guest. Riya Sinha is the USSC's Maitree Fellow, funded by the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And until October of 2024, she is going to be undertaking research on Indian-Australian cooperation and port connectivity across the Indian Ocean region for the U.S. Study Center's Economic Security Program. Now, to maybe start us off, Riya, I would love to hear how exactly you found yourself in Sydney, of all places, and doing the work that you're doing at the U.S. Study Center.
Well, first of all, thank you, Jared, for having me on this podcast. I am excited to be in Sydney and grateful to be hosted by the United States Study Center for this Maitree Fellowship, which is supported by DFAT's Center for Australia-India Relations. So my role here, my research here extends actually what I do back in India at my institution, Center for Social and Economic Progress. I work on India's infrastructure connectivity with the neighboring countries. I look at land and sea infrastructure and how India has performed, and the growing geoeconomic competition in port infrastructure development in the Indian Ocean region. Um, One of the a part of this is that even though India wants to be more engaged in the neighborhood, it cannot address this growing competition in the sector by itself. And this region, my research specifically focuses on the Northeast Indian Ocean region, or the Bay of Bengal, as we call it back home. This is an important region. It connects the Indian and Pacific Ocean. Half of the world's global trade passes through this region. 30% of the global trade is handled by the ports in this region. Yet there is a significant infrastructure deficit, and by this I mean both in hard and soft infrastructure terms. India cannot address this, cannot fill this gap on its own, and therefore it needs partners like the US, Australia, and Japan to support the infrastructure in the region. And Australia recognizes this region as important in various versions of its defense updates, yet the presence has been minimal compared to, say, US or Japan. Locally, there's demand for Australian expertise in port infrastructure development here, and therefore I'm here to conduct this research on how and where India and Australia can either collaborate or cooperate for port infrastructure development.
So that was a great overview of the research areas that you're looking at. But with that all said, I was hoping you could look a bit more closer to home with us today and maybe explain what just happened. Now, the Indian democratic system is the largest in the world, but it also has a lot of interesting nuances to it that I don't think many, including myself, are fully familiar with. So could you maybe explain sort of the election that took place, and maybe just from a logistical point of view, what were these elections for exactly?
Absolutely. So this is one of the largest democratic exercise, in fact, that takes place in the world. The Indian elections. These were the general Indian elections to select the new to elect the new government. we had about 643 million people voting this time, one of the largest in the world. And on June 4th, the election was the 6 week long election was concluded. And Prime Minister Modi claimed victory, although with a reduced majority for the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP this time in the National Democratic Alliance as well. So what we are seeing now in the post-election scenario is this is now we have a coalition government in India. The National Democratic Alliance, of which the BJP is a part, it won a total of 292 out of 540 seats in the Indian Parliament. So this is more than the 250% mark, the 272 seats required to secure a majority. So the NDA will be forming a government for sure, but this is the first time that the BJP did not secure a majority on its own. It had 240 seats this time compared to 303 in 2019. In 2019, because it had 303 more than 272 needed, it could form a majority government, but it's not the case this time. But on another side, Prime Minister Modi is now the second leader to have to have a third prime ministerial term in the Indian Parliament after India's first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. So that really speaks uh, about his power to be back in the government, about the votes that he could secure, that Prime Minister Modi could secure to be back in power. And a significant development that has taken place this year is that after 10 years, the lower house of the Indian Parliament, which is called the Lok Sabha, will have a leader of opposition. Earlier, this role was not claimed by any party because an opposition party needs at least 55 seats or 10% of votes in the Indian parliament to have a leader of opposition. So it could neither be claimed nor it was given by the Speaker of the House to anyone. But this time, the Indian National Congress's Rahul Gandhi has assumed that role because Congress got 99 seats, um, qualifying it to assume the role of the leader of opposition. So it's quite significant developments that have taken place around this elections. Shocks for many because it was assumed that Prime Minister Modi would come back in a majority. He did not. But this is an absolute win for democracy. We have a coalition government. We have a leader of opposition now, and this is going to mean several things domestically and for foreign policy going forward.
Yeah, I'd love to hear in terms of the precedence for this. It seemed like the BJP had only been increasing its political power um, every year for the past, is it 5, 10 years? I'd love to hear your take. Like, is this peak BJP? What do you attribute this change of and this surprise election outcome to exactly?
I think that the surprise. I mean, this was a surprise for everyone, including me. Uh, but yeah, I mean, going to the nitty gritties of it, what worked and what did not work. I think there are a lot of uh, while BJP is seen as a party, Prime Minister Modi himself is seen as a statesman who can take India to a global level, who can deliver reforms domestically, and in many areas reforms have been delivered. But India still has some persistent problems of unemployment, of development, of growing prices. So these are the issues which the new government will have to deliver on beyond, beyond prioritizing India's foreign policy issues. Domestic development will have to be the driving agenda forward, and taking into account different nuances of different states. To which I think the coalition government for which I think the coalition government is very important now. So we do expect to see a lot more development also going forward. I mean, there are risks with the coalition government that it could be a hung parliament at some times, but right now, at least the trajectory is that we do see more development going forward. It will be difficult to achieve in different areas because the a coalition government affects the BJP's ability by itself to carry out reforms, and it has to rely on the votes of the coalition partners as well. And now the leader of opposition will also have a say as a shadow prime minister. But the hope is that this will result in more effective democracy and governance.
I guess I would love to hear though, is this coalition government something that you're more familiar with? Are you more accustomed to coalition governments ruling in India, or is this a bit of a novel thing?
It's not a novel thing. We've had coalition governments before, whether it was the Congress leading a coalition government in the time of UPA 1 and UPA 2 till 2014, between 2004 and 2014 to now NDA. In fact, going into the elections, it was always going to be the NDA, but the expectation was that the BJP will have 370 seats and the other coalition partners will have roughly about 30 seats. That did not happen. BJP got much lower lower number of seats, which means its dependency on the coalition partners is much higher. That said, BJP still has the most number of seats. It will just have to find a way to take, say, the Telugu Desam Party or the Janata Dal United, these different coalition partners together, because there's always a risk with the coalition government of partners. The coalition not sticking together, partners seeking different partnerships, or there being a lot of disagreements. So I mean, going forward, we'll only see how this works.
In terms of going forward and how this works, do you see this having a significant impact on the trajectory of India's growth, both geopolitically, militarily, in the region? I mean, we are, after all, calling it the Indo-Pacific for some reason there. Do you see this having an impact, or if so, what type of impact?
Okay, so let me go back a little bit and explain how this would work in the Indian Parliament. So the Indian Parliament has the power to legislate on foreign affairs. Under the Constitution of India, there are two lists on the seventh schedule called the central list, which means that only the central government has the power to decide on certain subjects, and the state list, where the state governments decide, and a concurrent list. So the India's foreign policy or foreign affairs, defense, they all fall under the central or union list. So the parliament can decide on the amendment of any law, international treaty, regulations, India's foreign affairs going forward, on all of this. So therefore, the government is accountable to the parliament on this, and this is a coalition parliament now, which can seek answers on foreign policy issues. Some of these are also border states of India, um, which have issues with the neighboring countries in South Asia, for example. So there will be a lot more accountability in the parliament. There's also a parliament committee on external affairs, which seeks answers and looks at key foreign policy issues. It can summon ministers for seeking answers, etc. But under this new government, but under Modi 3.0, as many call it, we do expect a continuity in the foreign policy and the military policies. This means the prioritization of the immediate and extended neighborhood through India's Neighborhood First, Act East, and the Sagar policies for the Indian Ocean region, participation in regional, multilateral, and plurilateral forums, including the Quad, including some of the lead that India had taken with the Pacific Islands Forum. And also, India is seeking to become the third largest economy by the end of the decade. So, we do expect to see a continuity in the signing of trade agreements, for example, at different levels. But we do expect to see a continuity in that. India's position with respect to strategic autonomy in the geopolitical competition, particularly between the US and China and its own affairs, is something that we see will not change. And these are some of the things that in the last 10 years, there has been consensus across parties in India on foreign policy issues, on defense issues, because some of these are not just something that came up, because many of these foreign policy things and issues are not something that came up during Prime Minister Modi's leadership. These are also a continuity of India's foreign policy for the last 20 years, which came up during the Congress government and then continued with the BJP government. So there has been fairly a good consensus across parties on these issues, and this is likely to continue.
Now, sitting in Australia and how it has engaged with India, especially with the Quad, what recommendations would you give to Canberra for how to understand this election outcome and how to move forward with the ever-growing Australian-Indian relationship?
So Quad, I mean, India has a very different view of Quad than say what the expectations of the US would be or Australia would be. I can only speak about New Delhi's point of view. But the next thing to expect with the Quad is that the Leaders Summit is to be held in India this year. It has been postponed several times now because of Indian elections and now then US elections. The dates are not final yet. But reports suggest that it will take place later this year, and the U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, he was in India a few days back, and he met his counterpart Ajit Doval, and there are reports that that they did discuss what taking place later this year. For India, what is very important is in the Quad is the focus on non-traditional security issues. New Delhi has been very reluctant to discuss hard security issues in the Quad because it doesn't want to be part of a grouping that is known as anti China. And this is for two reasons. One is that India also seeks leadership of the global south and a greater regional role in itself. It wants to be involved with the countries in the global south. And the countries in the global south do not want to be put in an Indo Pacific or in an anti China or pro China camp. Therefore, that it has implications for India's broader engagement with the Indo Pacific region and with the global south. Second is this is also relevant because India has an ongoing border crisis situation with China since 2020, and it doesn't want to aggravate it further. So therefore, India will only want to focus on non-traditional security issues. And while maritime issues seem to be at the forefront of Quad Summit this year, it's a priority for Australia. It's a priority for the US. I think what India's expectations would be going forward, and if other Quad players want India to perform more in the grouping, it would be to continue focus on issues like maritime domain awareness. So we can expect more participation from India, say, in the Indo-Pacific maritime domain awareness front. In the other six working groups, including on health security, infrastructure, climate, critical and emerging technology, space, and cyber. To provide development goods to the region, and useful and practical public goods can be disseminated. So it will see a lot more partnership with Australia on this front rather than say another I mean, another Malabar military exercise, for example, being labeled as a Quad exercise. That is something that India will not be comfortable with. And I think going forward, Australia and India need to keep this mind when they are cooperating in the Quad. Bilaterally, of course, there are many things that are going to take India and Australia's relations forward, including the growing trade relationship. It was actually here that I discovered that Australia does have an ongoing infrastructure connectivity plan in the South Asian region called the South Asia Infrastructure for Regional Connectivity, so the SARIC program that DFAT runs. It's a it's a $32 million program where Australian government works with the World Bank and IFC to deliver projects, and that's something that India is comfortable with and would seek higher presence of Australia because I think it's the visibility of Australia in the region that is lacking, and that is something that India would definitely welcome. Trade relations, growing diaspora, growing investments. I think these are all areas that will grow the relation stronger in the next. It's already growing, and these are the areas which will develop further in the next few years.
That was a great overview of what India is expecting from the Quad and maybe the differences between U.S. and Australian expectations of the Quad. Though I guess we also have to be realistic about the probably the most signature initiative of the Quad was the vaccine initiative that perhaps was not as successful as many had hoped it would be. So I guess there's a lot of room for growth in the Quad. I guess my last question before I ask you about a stat would be in terms of Australian and American perceptions of India itself. I think this is related to your comment before. Do you think that Australian and American perceptions of India and the role of India geopolitically and as we adopt the Indo-Pacific framework, do you think that Australian and American perceptions of India are sort of appropriate, or do you think that there's maybe more ambition for areas that India is not as keen to engage on? Where do you see the sort of the expectations of the not just the Quad, but really just the bilateral in terms of in terms of where um, the bilateral relationships are going?
Yeah, thank you for that last question. I think it's a difficult one, but also the most interesting one. I think here we need to see it in three separate or even actually related silos of perception, of expectation, and of practicality. Perception can be one part of it. I mean, we do see growing. We've seen from both India, from mostly the United States. Um, the perceptions on India's democracy, for example, on communal harmony in India, and there have been several quotes on that, which New Delhi has responded to. But does that affect US seeing India or Australia seeing India as a like-minded partner in the Indo-Pacific region? For me, the answer is no. There are growing number of exercises. There are growing number of there's a growing amount of cooperation in different sectors that is taking place in the region. Infrastructure being one of those sectors. Very recently, the United States gave $400 million, for example, the development of Colombo Port's west coast terminal that India is now developing in Colombo. So that is something that is a cooperative mechanism that we see increasing in the region. We see the increasing number of naval exercises. Um, like I mentioned, NSA Jake Sullivan was in India this week, and we saw a range of talks and agreements on critical and emerging technologies, on critical minerals programs. So there are a lot of areas of convergence, despite the what the perceptions could be. The expectation is for India to be a reliable partner in the Indo-Pacific development and security space, because the partners cannot always be present themselves. For India, also, it is seeking a partnership with like-minded. It is partnership or engagement with like-minded partners, Australia, US, Japan in the region, to engage in all of these countries which are critical for India's security, both traditional and non-traditional, which are critical for India's development, for India's position as a regional leader. Because I do hear that there are perception issues with India, but I don't think that in any way affects the ability of India to become a partner, whether it is in the new India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, the multimodal connectivity program, whether it is the I2U2. So India is being seen as a critical and reliable partner in these growing number of forums, and I think this is something that is going to continue.
Fantastic. I am so glad to have your expertise with us at the U.S. Study Center. We have basically created our own little quad program with fellows from now India and Japan, and some Yanks like myself, as well as a very strong Australian team that continues to have put out excellent research on these topics and much more. So we've come to the end of our podcast. So it is time for me to ask you, Ria, do you have a stat or figure that you want to share with us that's related to our conversation today?
Okay, so one interesting stat here is how India's focus on maritime cooperation with the Quad, with the Indo-Pacific countries, also reflects domestically, because the share of Indian Navy in the defense budget, for example, has increased from 4% in the 1960s and 70s to 14 to 16% today. And this is in line with various of India's policies on the maritime front, including the Sagar policy, which is an acronym for security and growth for all in the region, as well as the Sagarmala policy, which focuses on maritime connectivity and port-led development.
Excellent. That is the sort of stat that I love to hear from a think tanker, going from 4 to 14 to 16%. I think that's pretty telling about what India is prioritizing these days. Well, thank you so much, Ria, for an excellent conversation. I learned quite a lot about a really important election, and I look forward to reading more and hearing more from you in the months to come. So with that, I will highlight that this is one of a couple of podcasts that we do at the U.S. Study Center. Our CEO, Dr. Michael Green, also hosts a podcast with Jude Blanchette from CSIS in Washington, D.C., called the Asia Chessboard. We also have the USSC Live series, where you can hear our 2024 election podcast or events, including the U.S. election and how that's changing all of these dynamics as well. So I look forward to hearing you and reading more of your analysis very soon, Rio.